Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to untangle how a trading company, the East India Company, ended up ruling huge chunks of India.
It really shows how economic goals, political maneuvering, and the lives of everyday people all intertwine.
Decisions made for profit had massive consequences for millions in India.
Absolutely.
Let's set the scene. The year is 1765.
Okay.
The East India Company wins a big battle, and they're granted the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. What does Diwani even mean?
So the Diwani basically meant control over the revenue system in those areas. Imagine a company, all about trade, suddenly having to collect taxes and handle a giant territory's finances.
Right.
It's a turning point where they shift from merchants to, well, administrators.
Like going from running a shop to running a whole country's taxes.
Yeah.
Huge change.
Exactly. And a company focused on profit, they face big challenges. At first, they seem to just want to get as much revenue as possible without truly getting the existing systems or the people's needs.
And that led to problems, right?
Yes.
They wanted to fill their coffers, so they increased demands on people already struggling. And then, bam, a massive famine hits Bengal in 1770.
That famine, it wiped out something like a third of Bengal's population. A horrible tragedy, but it was also a wake-up call for the company.
Yeah.
Their policies were flawed. They had to rethink things.
Okay, so after this famine, they need a new plan.
Right.
That's where the Permanent Settlement of 1793 comes in. The name's a bit ironic, isn't it? Permanent.
You're right. Nothing in history is really permanent, and this settlement eventually changed and got replaced. But at the time, they saw it as creating stability and ensuring steady revenue for the company.
How did it work? What was the idea?
Well, they recognized these local power figures, zamindars, and gave them the job of collecting rent from the cultivators and paying a fixed amount to the company.
Okay.
It was supposed to simplify things, having these middlemen guarantee the company got its due.
Instead of dealing with tons of farmers, they had zamindars to collect taxes. Seems efficient, at least at first glance.
That was the goal. But as so often happens, the reality was more complicated.
I bet.
The permanent settlement, meant to bring order, ended up having some, well, pretty negative unintended consequences.
Let's get into those consequences. Where did it go wrong? What can we learn from it?
One big issue was that the fixed revenue demanded from zamindars, it was often way too high. Many struggled to meet it, forcing them to squeeze the peasants even more just to survive. Profit, not the well-being of the cultivators, became the main driver.
So instead of stability, it created more problems, burdening those already struggling.
Exactly, and here's where it gets interesting. As agricultural production increased, prices rose. The zamindars benefited, but the company didn't. They were stuck with a fixed revenue. They couldn't capitalize on the growing economy.
A beat oversight. They created a system where zamindars could take from the land without sharing the extra profits.
Yes, it showed a key problem in their thinking. They wanted control and steady revenue, but they didn't want to really engage with the complexity of governing and adapting to change.
Trying to have it both ways.
Mm-hmm.
Before we look at the other revenue systems, what's the biggest takeaway from the permanent settlement?
I think it's that you have to understand the local situation and be aware of unintended consequences when you impose rigid solutions from the top down.
Right.
The permanent settlement was meant to be good, stability, streamlined revenue, but they didn't truly grasp land ownership, social hierarchies, the economic reality on the ground.
Yeah.
They ended up making things worse for the very people they were supposed to help.
Such an important point. Simple solutions for complex problems, it often backfires. We see it again and again, even today. Policies need to be designed carefully, considering all the nuances.
Yeah.
But the company, they weren't done experimenting, always looking for more revenue, and their next attempts took them to other parts of India with new approaches.
Yes, they did.
So the permanent settlement, well, it didn't work out quite like they hoped, and by the early 1800s, the company was looking for something new. They realized India was too diverse, too complex for a one-size-fits-all approach. What did they try next?
They started experimenting. One new system was the Mahalwari system in 1822, places like the northwestern provinces.
Okay.
They were trying to fix some of the permanent settlements problems, especially those huge demands on individual zamindars.
So how was Mahalwari different? Totally new idea.
Not totally new, but there were some big changes. Instead of focusing on one zamindar, Mahalwari assessed revenue on entire villages or groups of villages called mahals.
I see.
The burden was spread across the whole village community.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah.
More equitable, right. Instead of one person squeezed, the whole village shared the burden.
Exactly. The village headman, usually a respected elder, would collect from the cultivators and pay the company. They were using existing social structures, hoping for a more manageable system.
Did it work, though?
Hmm.
Did Mahalwari solve the problems of the permanent settlement?
It was better in some ways, definitely spread the burden more evenly, but still not perfect. Revenue assessments, though they were revised sometimes, were often still way too high. Peasants still struggled to pay.
So that core issue, too much revenue being demanded, it stuck around even with this new system.
It did.
Seems like the company just couldn't find that balance between getting as much money as possible without wrecking the agricultural economy.
They were always walking that tightrope. At the same time as Mahalwari in the north, they tried something else in the south, the Ryotwari system.
Right, Wari. Thomas Monroe's big idea, he had a whole different way of thinking about revenue.
He did.
What was his vision for Ryotwari?
Monroe thought the best way was to go straight to the cultivators, the riots, cut out those zamindar middlemen altogether.
Interesting.
He thought it would be fairer, no zamindars to exploit the peasants.
Go straight to the source.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty radical compared to the old systems.
Yeah.
How did they make this direct relationship with the riots work?
It was a huge project. They surveyed all the land, assessed revenue on each plot based on things like the soil, irrigation,
Right.
detailed records of land holdings, like an early map of who owned what in South India.
That's incredibly ambitious, a really data-driven system.
Yeah.
But did it actually help the riots?
Good intentions, but it didn't quite live up to the ideal. The revenue, even though they were so careful measuring everything, it was still often too high. Riots struggled to pay, went into debt, had to sell their land.
So despite all the effort, all the record-keeping, Ryotwari still burdened the people it was supposed to help. Seems like no matter what they tried, the company couldn't escape the problems of their own greed, really.
It's true. And these weren't just policies. They had real, often terrible effects on millions of Indian lives. Shaped the countryside, changed farming, changed whole communities.
Absolutely. These weren't just abstract ideas, they had a huge ripple effect. Before we move on to how the company started influencing what was actually grown in India, why do you think these systems failed, even when they seemed like good ideas?
Well, there are a few things to consider. First, the company's main goal was always profit. They wanted stability, some prosperity in the places they ruled, but ultimately they wanted to take as much wealth from India as possible. That always influenced their decisions and often undermined any attempt at fairness.
So even when they tried to be fair, their greed got in the way.
Yes. And second, I think they were arrogant. They didn't really understand Indian society, imposing their own ideas without understanding the details, the existing structures.
Classic problem. Outside solutions for a situation you don't really get.
Exactly. And third, I think they underestimated the people. The company saw Indians as people to be managed, controlled. They didn't expect them to adapt, resist, change the outcomes.
Important to remember. Even under colonial rule, people find ways to make their own choices?
Absolutely. And that becomes even more clear when we look at indigo.
Okay.
The company wanted to control what was grown, and it led to resistance, rebellion, a real reckoning with the human cost.
Okay, before we go there, anything else about these revenue systems that stands out to you?
Well, even though they were flawed, they changed India. They changed who owned land, how people farmed, created new social hierarchies. Their impact is still felt today, really.
A good reminder. History isn't just the past. It shapes the present in powerful ways.
It does.
All right, let's talk indigo, a plant that became a symbol of exploitation and resistance. We've been talking about revenue, but the company's ambitions in India went beyond just taxes. They saw the land as a source of raw materials for their industries back in Europe.
Right.
One crop they really focused on was indigo. The source of that deep blue dye that was in such high demand in Europe at the time. It's amazing how a simple plant, a color, gets tied up in all this complexity of colonialism and resistance.
Yeah.
What made the company so interested in indigo?
It really shows how economics and colonial power worked together. Demand for indigo was huge in Europe. The textile industry, especially in Britain, was booming, and wouldn't you know it, their usual sources of indigo in the West Indies and America were declining. A lot of reasons for that, including the revolution in Haiti. The company saw a chance to step in, make India their indigo supplier.
So, always looking for a way to profit from India. How did they turn the Indian countryside into these big indigo farms? Did they just tell the farmers, stop growing your food, grow indigo instead?
Oh, it was much more complicated and a lot more coercive than just telling them what to do. The company used different tactics. They
Okay.
offered advances, loans, tried to get farmers to switch to indigo. But these financial incentives, they usually came with conditions.
I bet they did.
Contracts that basically forced farmers to grow a certain amount of indigo and sell it at a price the company set.
Huh.
You can guess those contracts weren't exactly fair to the Indian farmers.
Creating that dependency. Lure them in with a promise, and then trap them in a system that only benefits the company. Tell me more about these contracts.
There were two main ways they did it, Nij and Riadi. With Ni, the planters, most of them European, controlled the land directly,
Right.
hired workers to cultivate the indigo. This way needed a lot of investment up front and often caused problems with local communities because the planters wanted lots and lots of land. Sometimes they took it by force.
So niche, direct control for the planters, but it had its own problems. What about Riadi?
Riadi was a lot more common and sadly much more exploitative. Here, the planters had these contracts with the ryots, the actual farmers.
Yeah.
They practically forced them to grow indigo on part of their land. They'd supply the seeds, sometimes give advances, but the ryots did the work, and they often had to use their best land, their most fertile land, for the indigo, leaving them with less for their own food.
Setting them up to fail, really.
Yeah.
Grow this cash crop for us, even if it means you can't feed yourselves. I doubt they were getting rich off the indigo either.
No, they weren't. Prices were kept low on purpose. The ryots were always in debt, dependent on the planters.
Trapped in a terrible system. But like we see so often in history, oppression leads to resistance. The indigo farmers in Bengal, they weren't going to just take it. Their anger boiled over, and that's how we got the Dew Rebellion. Tell me about that rebellion.
The Blue Rebellion in 1859, it was a turning point in the whole story of indigo in India.
Yeah,
Thousands of cultivators in Bengal, they'd had enough.
right.
They refused to grow indigo anymore, attacked the factories, fought back against the planters' enforcers.
So brave of them to stand up like that, even though it was so dangerous. What caused it to finally explode?
Well, the indigo system itself was awful, of course, but a few things came together. People still remembered the 1857 revolt, thought maybe the British would actually listen to them this time, and the local zamindars, they had their own issues with the planters, so they supported the riots.
Interesting how different groups, all with their own complaints, could unite against a common enemy. That shared suffering, it can create some powerful alliances. How did the British react? Did they just crush it with force like they usually did?
This rebellion, it really shook things up in colonial India. The British couldn't ignore it. Thousands of people rising up, they had to do something, especially with the 1857 revolt still fresh in their minds. They decided to investigate.
Oh.
Set up the Indigo Commission to actually listen to the riots' grievances.
They actually listened. That doesn't sound like that.
It was a change from their usual tactics. And this Indigo Commission, after looking into things, they confirmed it. The planters were forcing people, the riots were suffering. A big victory for the rebellion, and it showed what people can do when they work together.
Even those in power can be forced to see the truth.
Yes.
When the evidence is overwhelming and people are united. Did the rebellion change the indigo industry for good?
It had a huge effect in Bengal. Indigo production went way down. The planters were being watched, facing all this resistance. But it didn't disappear entirely. It shifted to other places, Bihar, for example, where the same exploitation continued. It even became part of Gandhi's Champaran movement in 1917.
So the fight went on, and eventually became part of the movement for India's freedom. As we wrap up our look at this part of history, what are the main things you hope people take away from it?
I think the story of indigo reminds us of the real human cost of colonialism. How profit too often comes before people. How systems get built to keep things unfair. But it also shows how powerful resistance can be. How even the most powerful systems can be challenged.
Very well said. A story that still resonates, reminding us that the fight for fairness and dignity is never truly over. And as we leave our listeners with this thought, I can't help but think about our own world today.
Yeah.
Global supply chains connect us all, but often we don't see the people behind the products, the human cost. What can we learn from indigo to help us make better choices in our own time? Something I hope all of you will continue to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.